Tonight, an NBC News special report. President Biden dropping out of the race for the White House. The historic bombshell now rocking the race for president. The president throwing his support behind his vice president, Kamala Harris. Prominent Democrats coming out in support of her.
Members are very excited. Voters on the ground are very excited. The party is very excited.
But huge questions remain. Will the party unite behind her? Does she have a better chance of taking on former President Trump? Or will this be a fight all the way to the convention?
She's crazy. She's nuts.
Former President Trump speaking to our correspondent. What he says about this political earthquake. Voters across the country reacting.
I think he didn't have a chance against Trump.
It was a shock, but at the same time, they must feel it's best for the election.
Tonight, how this historic decision played out and the big questions moving forward as the battle for the White House enters uncharted territory.
This is an NBC News special report. President Biden exits the 2024 race. Reporting tonight, Lester Holt.
Good evening. It is a historic day for our nation and a major shakeup in American politics. President Joe Biden has withdrawn from his campaign to become the second-term commander-in-chief amid concerns over his health. Today, writing in a statement, I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and to focus solely on fulfilling my duties as president for the remainder of my term. The president endorsing his second-in-command, Kamala Harris, as the nominee. But questions remain over whether she'll secure the full backing of Democrats with just over 100 days to go before voters go to the polls. Today, the Republican nominee, Donald Trump, called Biden the worst president in the history of the U.S. These new developments tee up questions about every angle of what is going to be a chaotic path to the upcoming elections and eventually to the White House. Questions like, will Kamala Harris secure her party's nomination? Who would be her running mate? What would the debates look like? And what are voters making of this historic whiplash? Let's bring in... This afternoon, an about-face by President Biden, announcing he will be a one-term president, dropping his bid for the White House, saying, I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and to focus solely on fulfilling my duties as president for the remainder of my term. And in another statement, endorsing his vice president, Kamala Harris, to take his place at the top of the ticket. Harris releasing her own statement today, saying in part, I am honored to have the president's endorsement, and my intention is to earn and win the nomination. This after weeks of pressure on Mr. Biden following that June debate performance, which stunned President Biden's party, supporters, and donors. Since then, President Biden has been trying to right the ship.
I would not be running again if I didn't believe with all my heart and soul I can do this job.
And reassure his party that he was up for the job.
And I know, like millions of Americans know, when you get knocked down, you get back up.
We last spoke in the White House just last week.
Who do you listen to on deeply personal issues, like the decisions whether to stay in the race or not?
Me. Look, I've been doing this a long time. The idea that I'm the old guy, I am. I'm old. But I'm only 3 years older than Trump, number one. And number two, my mental acuity's been pretty damn good.
After today's announcement, reaction from former President Barack Obama, who called Joe Biden a patriot of the highest order, describing the decision as a testament to Joe Biden's love of country. Praise from Bill and Hillary Clinton for his extraordinary career of service, while highlighting their worry about the threat posed by a second Trump term.
President Biden doesn't run. Why shouldn't we consider you a likely candidate?
Well, I think the vice president is naturally the one lined up.
In the past, Harris has made it clear she understands what it means to be a heartbeat away from the presidency.
Every vice president understands that when they take the oath, that they must be very clear about the responsibility they may have to take over the job of being president. I am no different.
She led the Biden administration's response on critical issues like abortion access and the immigration crisis, coming under fire from Republicans for the White House's handling of the border. I pressed her on the topic in 2021.
We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe. And I mean, I don't understand the point that you're making. I'm not discounting the importance of the border.
Now, she and the party are facing a new challenge at an uncertain and unprecedented time. Let's bring in NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell. Kelly, what have you gathered in terms of how this all came together? Up till a few days ago, he was talking about campaigning into the next week. What happened?
Well, this has been a very human moment for the president and one that has huge historical implications. This weekend, with closest advisors and family at Rehoboth Beach, where he has a home there in Delaware, he has been reviewing some of the information about how Vice President Harris would fare in polling against Donald Trump. That's one thread of information. Clearly, he has been hearing the roughly 40 lawmakers of his own party who have publicly called for him to step aside. He has heard about the donors who have pulled away. He has recognized the drumbeat of pressure that has been around him. All of that coming together. Ultimately, the decision was considered yesterday and into today, and he kept it in what we are told was a very close hold with only a few advisors who knew that he had made this decision until he announced it to his team and then publicly. The First Lady, of course, saying that she has been with him on this and very supportive of whatever decision he would make. Now, part of what this does, this day of decision, is it allows the president to focus on his own final months in office, his legacy, trying to complete things that he wants to get done. In your interview with him, Lester, he said there is more work to do, and it gives him a chance to do that. He's also injected something new into the race, where Kamala Harris, throwing his support behind her, is roughly 20 years younger than Donald Trump, and she will then have to pick a running mate. And so there are some new ways the Democrats can get energized. There may be a challenge to her getting the nomination. That is still to be determined. The apparatus of the campaign does give Kamala Harris the funding and the operation that was put together for the two of them. So she is the heir to that in terms of the structure, the money, and the operation. That is formidable against anyone else in the party who might seek to get the nomination. So we are at a point. This is clearly historical. There is a human aspect where this has been very painful for the president and disappointing for him. And now it's a page-turning moment where the party has a chance to again focus on Donald Trump and also try to make certain it has a ticket going forward that's ready for the convention and ready for the next several months, fighting to November.
All right,
Lester?
Kelly, let me bring in our Meet the Press moderator, Kristen Welker, and senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson. Kristen, first to you. Is it important that the president appears to be all in on this thing? There are going to be opportunities to perhaps campaign for his successor. How is that all going to look?
Lester, it's critical that President Biden made the decision to endorse his vice president, Kamala Harris, because he is sending a signal to the party. Let's move forward with Vice President Harris for all of the reasons that Kelly just mapped out. She inherits the war chest that he has been building up, and that is not insignificant. And look, we know that the CBC has said that it supports Kamala Harris as well as a number of Democrats. So this is a significant moment. And again, Lester, it's about sending a signal to the party that it is time to move forward, and also sending a signal that instead of having a mini primary, which some folks are calling for, he's clearly urging the party to get behind Kamala Harris so that they can start the hard work of trying to take on former President Donald Trump. Think about what we all witnessed last week in Milwaukee, the Republican National Convention, this party united around former President Trump. That really added urgency, I think, to this situation, to the calculation that Democrats have. And remember the polling, Lester, a majority of Americans saying they don't want to see this matchup between Trump and Biden. And so part of the calculus here, in addition to everything that Kelly mapped out, is this opportunity to inject a new face. Yes, she is the vice president, but I've been talking to a lot of sources who say that she will reintroduce herself. She's clearly found her voice in a number of different areas, including reproductive rights. One top Democrat telling me, quote, They're breathing a sigh of relief because now there is someone who can prosecute the case against former President Trump. So the question for Harris now becomes, who will she seek to become her running mate if, in fact, she does get the nomination? But Lester, again, as she said, she's still got to fight and win the nomination. So there are still a few more steps that have to take place.
Yeah, I want to bring Hallie into the conversation on that point. Hallie, it's Washington. You know how Washington works. It's hard to imagine that there aren't those on the sidelines right now who are looking to see if there's an opening here. So those who are saying that the current Vice President Harris has a lock for this, is it going to take a few days to see how it all settles out?
Yeah, almost certainly, Lester, but I'd be surprised if it takes too much longer than that, because all along, as you and as Kristen have been talking about, even with this public pressure increasing for President Biden to do what he did and withdraw from the ticket, there has been a desire for Democrats to basically get unified and get unified quickly, because they understand that the election is creeping closer and closer every single day, and that it behooves them politically to be united as a party here. So to that end, the question becomes, obviously, who ends up on the Democratic ticket now? Vice President Harris is in the pole position here. If, in fact, she does end up taking the top of the ticket, the question becomes, who would her running mate be? And there's a number of people, and I want to be clear, speculation at this moment, who could end up in that position. You're seeing the names and the pictures of some of them here, including some of whom could challenge her potentially for the top of the ticket if they chose to. Again, TBD on that, but you're looking at people like Michigan's Gretchen Whitmer, Pennsylvania's Josh Shapiro, California's Gavin Newsom. He obviously spoke with Chuck. You saw that interview months ago and said that it would be Vice President Harris's ticket to lose if it were to come to that. There's Roy Cooper from North Carolina, Andy Beshear from Kentucky, J.B. Pritzker from Illinois, and Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona. A couple of things to talk about on this list here. Vice President Kamala Harris, again, this is all assuming she ends up at the top there and becomes the presumptive and then official nominee for the Democratic Party. She is already from the West Coast. She's already from California. She's already got the support of a number of progressives. We have seen that today already with, for example, the chair of the Progressive Caucus coming out and throwing her support behind Kamala Harris. The question is, what is this ticket going to do to reach out to people in, for example, the middle of the country, in these key Rust Belt swing states, in some of these critical places, suburban women, swing voters, this small slice of independents who Democrats hope will turn out and help them win the White House now for a second term. That is why I think you're seeing some of the names, for example, the governor from Pennsylvania, obviously one of those critical states. You're seeing somebody like Roy Cooper. North Carolina is a place that has swung purple. I mean, it's been red, it's been blue, it's been back. And so that's another question mark there for somebody like Governor Cooper. You're seeing Andy Beshear from Kentucky. Think about who Donald Trump just picked as his running mate, J.D. Vance, somebody who the Trump campaign believes can really speak to people in those Rust Belt states. There is some thinking among Democrats that perhaps Governor Beshear could be that same kind of voice, but on the Democratic side of the ticket. All of this, Lester, let's be clear, is preliminary. You already have two of these people, Senator Kelly and Governor Shapiro, that have backed Kamala Harris, have endorsed her as the presidential nominee. But I think that things are going to move potentially fairly quickly over the course of the next few days, over the course of the next week. I happen to suspect that you might have some Democrats who wait for President Biden to come out and make his remarks publicly, as we expect him to do later on this week once he recovers from COVID, Lester. But obviously, this is a major, major moment in this campaign. It just upends it altogether at this moment. We do have some polling showing that Kamala Harris, maybe she does just as well or perhaps slightly better than President Biden against former President Trump. But let's be clear here. We don't have a lot of clarity. This has all been hypothetical up until about 7 hours ago, Lester.
I was going to mention the polling is only valuable to the extent that people see her as a vice president. Seeing her in a position of a presidential candidate has to be different. The conversation will, of course, come up about the first black woman potentially president. So what we know from the past, will it be relevant as we watch marching forward here, people showing their support to her?
Yeah, it'll certainly be relevant, but there is also, to Kristen's point, people who may give Kamala Harris another look, a second look. She is somebody who has been on the national stage for quite a while now. Remember, she ran for president herself unsuccessfully before she was named Joe Biden's running mate. Prior to that, she was a prosecutor in California, rose to become the attorney general in that state, well known there. So she is not an unknown entity here and not a household name. But obviously, the course of her presidential campaign, there have been some concerns raised from Democrats who saw the way that her campaign was was run. Saw some question marks around that. There is going to be a desire that she inherits the war chest, inherits the operation from the Biden-Harris campaign, what was formerly that campaign, so that she is in a position where she has some solid footing moving forward. The question certainly becomes, though, her next public appearance, her next few. What does that look like? What does it look like if and when she ends up on a debate stage with former President Trump? Does that debate even happen? Will there be a vice presidential debate, considering that there is, at this point, not even a vice presidential nominee on the Democratic side? So still a lot of questions to be answered, Lester.
And Kristen, what's the view, do you think, from Team Trump right now in terms of whether they really want to go up against her or they would have preferred for Biden to stay?
Oh, I think that the Trump campaign was prepared to take on President Biden. And so, as Hallie says, this upends everything. Now, having said that, we know that the Trump campaign has already started doing its opposition research against Vice President Harris, as well as, quite frankly, all of those governors who Hallie was just talking about, because they are also potential candidates to be the Democratic nominee if they so choose. So I think that they are getting this in gear and have been for quite some time, Lester, but there's no doubt, particularly in the wake of that debate performance by President Biden, that they thought they had the upper hand in this race. The polling bore that out both nationally and in the battleground states. And so the Trump campaign is really going to have to pivot here. There's no doubt about that. We're going to see a strategy shift, Lester.
All right, Kristen, thank you. We're hearing from Vice President Harris tonight, thanking Joe Biden for his endorsement. But so many questions remain. Will she get the full backing of top Democrats, as we've been discussing? And how will voters respond to her? Here's Yamiche Alcindor with what's ahead in this historic time.
All eyes now turning to Vice President Kamala Harris, who has made history over and over again throughout her life. Her biggest history-making moment was when she was elected vice president in 2020, becoming the first woman and first Black and first South Asian person to hold that role.
We believe that our country, all of us, will stand together for a better future.
Before that, she had forged a path, shattering glass ceilings. In 2003, she served as district attorney of San Francisco, becoming the first Black woman and South Asian American woman in California to hold that office. Then, 7 years later, she made history again, in the same way when she was elected Attorney General of California. The role made her a rising star in the Democratic Party. In November 2016, Harris became only the second African-American woman ever to serve in the Senate and the first Indian-American ever.
Mr. President, I rise to celebrate the anniversary of one of the most significant legislative achievements in American history, the passage of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act.
She was raised in California, the daughter of a Jamaican father and Indian mother who met as civil rights activists. She later attended Howard University, a historically Black college in Washington, D.C. She went on to law school at the University of California. Then she became a prosecutor, a role she says helped her enact criminal justice reform from within the systems. She often worked on cases dealing with sexual violence. In 2020, she ran for president, hoping to become the first Black woman ever to be president. Now she will try to forge that path again.
And Yamiche joins me now. Yamiche, how are Vice President Harris and her allies preparing for a potential campaign against Trump?
Well, Vice President Kamala Harris spent today calling around at Democratic leaders, telling them that she believes she has the confidence to beat Donald Trump. She's been telling them that she's going to earn this nomination, and she's going to really talk to all of the different delegates to make sure she can officially win the nomination at the convention. I spoke to one of the people who got a call from Kamala Harris today, Vice President Harris. He was the Congressional Black Caucus Chairman, Stephen Hortzford. He told me that he got emotional during that call because, of course, the history that she's going to make if she was to become not only the top of the ticket, but the first Black woman to be elected. He told me that she told her that this was really going to be a race that she was going to try to not take any constituency for granted. I was also told in the last few weeks that her allies were focusing on the fact that she was going to have to build a campaign operation. So even though she's getting that war chest from the Biden-Harris campaign, there is this idea that she's going to have to build a different kind of campaign tailored specifically to her. And as part of that, she's going to have to be thinking about her path to victory. I'm told by sources close to her that they're really looking at states like North Carolina and Georgia, thinking about Southern African American voters and really mobilizing them the most. But there's a long to-do list here. Of course, first picking her vice president, but also shoring up donations, because at a time like this, in the last few weeks, donations had plummeted to Democrats into the Biden campaign. So there are a lot of people who are now sort of saying that there are a lot of donors who are energized, really ready to get behind her. I'm also told that she's going to be traveling. Just this week, she's going to be going to Milwaukee, as well as Indianapolis. She's going to be continuing to go on the road as she makes this case to voters, but she has to make up for lost time here. So people close to her say that she's going to be doing that. She's going to be thinking about the staff to hire here, and she's also going to be thinking about her messaging, specifically because she looks like she's polling best among young people, and that her voice has also resonated with women because she took the lead on abortion access and the messaging for the campaign there, Lester.
All right, Yamiche Alcindor, thank you. I want to bring in Democratic Senator from Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar, who has just endorsed Vice President Harris. Senator, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Lester. Thank you.
You have endorsed her, but you notably did not call for President Biden to drop out. Can you explain that?
I think that people played different roles over this last month, but for me, this is not about looking in the rearview mirror. People expressed their concerns in different ways, but ultimately this was the president's decision, and he took the honorable path, Lester. He took the path which is consistent with his career of conviction, of integrity, and I know it's not just about his legacy, getting us through the pandemic with Vice President Harris at his side, working so hard to bring NATO together, moving forward on taking on the pharmaceutical companies. It's also about the future, and his endorsement of Kamala Harris shows that he is laser focused on the next 6 months, yes, but also on the years to come.
Do you think we will continue? We've seen a groundswell of people in Democrats endorsing Vice President Harris. Do you think that will continue, that this will be a non-issue? She will be the person in short order?
Well, sure. We're a big tent party, and that's why we win. We bring people with us. And so perhaps someone else would run. I don't know. But what I know is she's gathering, yes, was mentioned, progressive endorsements, but Mark Warner, who is a moderate Democrat, he endorsed her. Mark Kelly, which you noted on your show, he endorsed her. So I think you see a coming together for a candidate who is a strong person. I know I ran against her for president. I saw how strong and fierce she is on that debate stage. But more than that, she brings the receipts. She's been a leader on the world stage, and she also, again, has worked on all of these policies and efforts that have brought us to fuller employment in a much better place than where we were coming out of the Trump administration. And finally, I cannot wait to see this scene where she's taken on Donald Trump, who said that he was proud to have overturned Roe v. Wade. He just said that in a video. And then she's the one that had cross-examined the very justices that made that decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. She will be able to make that case stronger than practically anyone.
I just spent part of last week in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention covering the activities there. It was a strong show of unity. What will the Democratic convention look like coming out of this crisis, if you will?
We always like to make news for you, Lester. Come on. So the first thing you're going to see is kind of a speed dating situation for the vice presidential candidate because there's just not the time that we've had in the past. However, Kamala Harris knows these leaders, some of the leading candidates, and I know she's going to pick someone that she can trust, that's a great leader and can govern, and then someone who is actually will augment her skills. So we'll stay tuned for that. Then you're going to have a convention that I predict will be unified. There'll have to be a process to get through this if there are others running, because as I said, we're a big tent party. But I promise a positive, unified, and yes, exciting next few weeks.
Could this be a moment that falls in the category, be careful what you wish for all those people who did call for the president to step aside? Is there still some difficult days ahead here, things that stand out to you potentially?
You know, I just think there is, some people are focused on the bitterness and people, what this person did and what they wrote and what they called. We don't have time for that. I'm sure there'll be books written. I'm sure there will be movies made about this last month. But the point is that we have to go together unified and put all that behind us. There is simply not time to dwell on the past.
All right. Senator, good to see you. Thanks so much for taking time.
It was great to be on. Thank you.
All right. Today, President Biden's challenger, Donald Trump, reacted to the news, calling Biden the worst president in history. It's a pivotal week for Donald Trump, leading in the polls after surviving the assassination attempt last week and securing his party's nomination at the Republican National Convention. But today's announcement throws the campaign into a level of chaos. Von Hilliard reports on that.
Please welcome. For months, the campaign of former President Donald Trump has prepared for a 2020 rematch with Joe Biden. But now its focus point will shift. In a social media post today, Trump writing, "We are forced to spend time and money on fighting crooked Joe Biden. He pulls badly after having a terrible debate and quits the race. Now we have to start all over again." A move he was already preparing for at his campaign rally last night in Michigan.
So who would you like to most run against if you're us, if we want to win? Ready? Kamala Harris.
The now official Republican nominee has maintained steady polling leads nationally and in each of the battleground states. Taken before Biden left the race, recent national polling has showed Harris' current positioning not that different from Biden in a hypothetical head-to-head matchup against Trump. But the Republican nominee already taking shots this weekend at the current vice president, who could become his direct opponent.
I call her Laughing Kamala. You ever watch her laugh? She's crazy. You know, you can tell a lot by her laugh. No, she's crazy. She's nuts.
Trump, meanwhile, will hold a campaign rally on Wednesday in battleground North Carolina, where a possible Democratic running mate hails from, current Democratic Governor Roy Cooper. RNC Chairman Michael Whatley said on Saturday, quote, "They have more than a messenger problem. They have a message problem because Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, no matter who else is on this ticket, is going to adopt those same platforms and those same policies. And they're out of step with the American people." The Trump campaign currently has its eyes on 7 key states, though the dynamics could change with the new Democratic nominee. And the former president could still face a sentencing in mid-September after being found guilty by a jury in Lower Manhattan. His legal team is preparing briefings for a judge challenging the verdict.
And Von Hilliard has been covering the Trump campaign. He joins me now. Von, what do we know about, I know it's really early, but what do we know about the potential for a debate between Mr. Trump and the vice president?
Right, Lester. Well, the reality was that there were 2 already scheduled presidential debates on the books between Donald Trump and the Biden campaign. And the second debate, of course, was going to be taking place this September on ABC. But Donald Trump, on a social media post just a few minutes ago, was suddenly opening up the door and questioning whether he wants to stick to that game plan. Of course, with Joe Biden no longer on the ticket and the question mark being whose presidential campaign is it actually going to be, there's some open question marks. He, though, in that social media post indicated that he would like Fox News to be the one that hosts the debate. We have reached out to multiple senior campaign advisors for clarification on the way that he is exactly viewing this politically and whether it'd be advantageous to go on the debate stage or not. It's not clear at this time. I was with the former president and 2024 Republican nominee's campaign yesterday in Grand Rapids, Michigan for that rally, and I was talking to a senior campaign official who told me that they were preparing for all potential circumstances. Well, for 20 months now, ever since Donald Trump first announced this third presidential bid, they've had their eyes on a Joe Biden rematch. And with just 3 months left, they knew that there could potentially be a jolt in this race on the Democratic side and a change. They had been looking at internal polling and, of course, had been studying not only Kamala Harris, but also other candidates who could potentially lead the top of the ticket. And, of course, is an open question mark then, who would be that vice presidential running mate to that Democratic nominee who would be taking on J.D. Vance, because he already has campaign events planned this week in Ohio and Virginia, Lester.
All right, Von, thank you. When we come back with our special coverage, we'll hear directly from the Trump campaign as the former president prepares to face off against a new Democratic nominee. That's coming up right after this. Welcome back to our NBC News special report on President Biden's historic decision to withdraw from the 2024 campaign. The Republican presidential nominee, former President Trump, talking to his social media platform Truth Social, or taking to that platform to criticize President Biden, calling him the worst president in the history of our nation. Let me bring in Trump campaign senior advisor Jason Miller. Jason, good to see you. Thanks for taking the time.
Lester, good evening.
I want to ask you, actually pick up a conversation we were having before the break about a debate. There is a debate that was on the books for September. Will it be transferable, as it were?
Well, there's definitely going to be another debate, or I guess in this case, a first debate against whoever the Democrats end up choosing. But I'm not sure that the Democrats are completely locked in on Kamala Harris yet. We see where former President Obama is still yet to endorse. There seems to be a lot of confusion and chaos on the Democrat side, which is in a big contrast to where the Republicans are, as you noted earlier with the United Front in Milwaukee this week. But one thing, Lester, really stands out to me. Less than 1 month ago, literally 3.5 weeks ago, Democrats were decrying the use of these so-called cheap fake videos of Joe Biden shuffling along, and within a month, President Trump has knocked Joe Biden out on the debate stage, and now Democrats have knocked Joe Biden out of the presidential race. And I think it really stands out to me that there's, with all this chaos today and the shift over to Kamala Harris, Democrats cannot name one single state where they're now in better position to win with Kamala Harris than they were with Joe Biden.
Well, you know, I know there's been a lot of polling that's been referenced, but I'm wondering how relevant that polling is. I mean, it's a new race. If the vice president gets into it, people will see it through different eyes. And, of course, there's the issue of the double haters we've watched develop over the last several months. Does that take that off the table and give voters a chance, someone other than, in this case, President Trump?
Yeah, really good question, because these are things that we've prepared for. We've polled, we've done the research, we have the ads cut. We're completely ready to go. This campaign is ready for anything that the Democrats throw at us. And the thing that really stands out from the Harris-Biden administration is that Kamala Harris owns all of the failures of the past 3.5 years, whether it be the record-setting illegal immigration. She was the border czar, for example, the sky-high inflation that's really crushing families all around our entire country. But when you look at the core issue of competence, that is the one thing that voters raise is a concern about Kamala Harris. They do not think that she is ready to step into that leadership position.
I was interested, you just said you guys are prepared for this. I mean, how prepared are you? There's things that move very quickly. How prepared are you to run a campaign that now pivots toward Vice President Harris?
Yeah, another great question, because we're ready for, again, whether it's Kamala Harris or anyone else they go and try to put in, because where this race changes is, as I said, Harris owns all of the failures of the last 3.5 years. There's also a new front that's going to be opened up here to give you a little bit of an insight. Kamala Harris had a long liberal record, radical record in California well before she even became vice president. You look at her efforts to decriminalize illegal immigration. You look at her calls to abolish ICE. I mean, heck, she wants to get rid of plastic straws, for goodness sake. And so, whereas Joe Biden was renting some of the territory on the more extreme left, Kamala Harris owns it. Lester, where the bottom falls out for Democrats, where they have real trouble, is in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Working class voters, union workers see Kamala Harris as a threat to their very existence, particularly in the auto industry.
She has also carried the administration's message about reproductive rights. It's something we didn't hear much of at the Republican convention. Does that change the campaign?
Well, it'll be up to the Democrats for what they talk about, but Kamala Harris is then going to be put on the spot for her more radical and extreme positions. So, for example, as remember in the debate, Joe Biden couldn't answer what he thought a reasonable restriction would be for late-term abortion. So there are a whole host of issues where Kamala Harris now has to answer. And one of those, Lester, that I think she has to answer is if Joe Biden is not competent enough to run for re-election as president, how can we say that he's competent enough to stay in the White House? Lester, you masterfully ran the Commander-in-Chief series on election after election, and you sat down with Joe Biden just a week ago. You know that Putin, Xi, the Iranians, all of our adversaries around the world are looking at the U.S. right now and licking their chops, saying that we have Joe Biden in the White House, and that's a dangerous thing. I want to know, does Kamala Harris think that Joe Biden is still competent enough to be president?
Jason Miller, thank you for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale is with me. Ali, we're just learning from two sources that West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin is, quote, considering a White House run. What more do we know about that right now?
Well, Lester, this would be the first potential challenger to Vice President Harris, who, of course, has the backing of many in her party in these intervening hours since her boss, President Biden, said he was no longer running for re-election. Manchin is at this point, according to these sources, considering a bid. But at this point, he also would have to change his party registration. Back in May, he changed from being a registered Democrat to a registered independent. In order to actually mount this bid, he would first have to change his party affiliation back. But of course, he spent several weeks and months on a listening tour of the United States. Ultimately, he did not end up running for president then. Many of his advisors say that that could be the same decision he falls to now, but of course, it's too early to tell.
And we're just weeks from the Democratic convention, as we just noted a moment ago. How are Democrats on the Hill rallying support for Harris or another candidate ahead of that?
Well, look, Harris is really the only name that we've heard at this point, Lester, and that's with good reason, especially because as you go into this convention, and yes, technically the Democratic convention is at the end of August, but what the DNC is actually planning on doing as early as the first week of August, so 2 weeks from now, they're doing a virtual nominating convention where they will nominate their nominee virtually. At that point, Harris has to earn the majority of delegates. If she doesn't, then it shifts to a very chaotic, potentially very messy, open convention. That's where someone like, if Manchin decides to put his hat in the ring, he will have to do some work behind the scenes to get delegates on board for him. All of that could lend to a perfectly chaotic process for Democrats, one that Senator Klobuchar was talking to you about just in the last few minutes, trying to put a happier spin on it. But really, this would be a chaotic moment for Democrats after a very tumultuous series of weeks here in Washington. That's why right now we're seeing so much effort behind Vice President Harris, not just from elected Democrats, but also from the Biden-Harris campaign itself, trying to give her the most advantage that she can get.
Chaotic. I think that's a word we may be hearing a lot of in the weeks to come. Ali Vitale, thank you. I want to bring in Congressman Lloyd Doggett now. He was the first sitting Democratic member of Congress to publicly call on the president to step aside. Congressman, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Lester.
You have not, unlike many of your colleagues, have not endorsed Vice President Harris. Do you intend to, or someone else?
Well, Lester, from the very moment almost 3 weeks ago that I called on President Biden to step aside, I called for a fair, open democratic process to select a replacement. Now, I think Vice President Harris would be an excellent nominee. She is the probable nominee. She has all the advantages. But I want this process to be open. It doesn't have to be decided within a matter of minutes or hours of President Biden's decision. We need to engage the entire country in this. That will make our nominee stronger if we have an open process. Some may call this chaotic. I call it democratic with a small d, and I think that's what people want.
Yeah, I was curious if it's the same as craziness, or I'm sorry, craziness, the word I'm looking for, but messiness, I'm sorry.
Messy it will be.
Does open mean, I'll get this question out eventually, does open mean messy?
Well, it does, and it means contentious, but as long as it's respectful disagreement, so much the better. As I said, I think Vice President Harris is the probable candidate, the likely one, and many of my colleagues and groups have been stampeding this afternoon to join her. I think that a number of the people that might have contested the nomination have already endorsed her, so I think it's headed that way. But let's keep the process open enough that anyone who thinks they can make a strong case that they're the best candidate to prevent Donald Trump and his gang from taking over our government and maybe never giving it back, that they have a chance also. If we have that process and Vice President Harris is selected, she'll be all the stronger for it. The virtual process, I must say, I don't believe is a good way to do this. We need this to be open, not through some virtual advance process as the DNC had originally proposed.
So what does that look like when we get to the convention then?
It looks like some of the conventions of old where you had multiple candidates competing, or in Vice President Harris's case, it could well be that her strong efforts eliminate most of the competition prior to that time. But it is a process where America sees that we're different than the Republicans, that we're offering a candidate for a new generation, that Donald Trump will be the old guy in this, that if it's Vice President Harris, she's a prosecutor who's fought crime. Donald Trump is someone who has committed crime.
You sort of led this movement. Have you had a desire? Do you plan to reach out to President Biden? Anything you would want to share with him?
Well, I would say that I greatly admire his courage. He did what Donald Trump could never do, and that is to put country over his ego. His legacy will be that he did everything he possibly could, including sacrificing his own future, in order to save our country from someone who wants to move us in an authoritarian direction.
Have you thought about him? I'm sorry, please.
No, I admire him and appreciate his accomplishments and the sacrifice that he's made.
Do you concern yourself? Do you think about the fact if you were wrong, if this does not help defeat Donald Trump, what that means to you, the party going forward?
Well, certainly that's always a consideration, but I looked at the numbers, hoping that after a year on your newscast and others that we saw the president behind in this, and then in this debate that instead of a surge, we got a setback, that the numbers in one battleground state after another showed us going the wrong way. And based on those numbers, I think we have a stronger nominee without President Biden on the ballot, and I'm glad he finally reached the same conclusion.
Lloyd Doggett, Congressman, thank you for being with us. Appreciate it. President Biden's announcement will have a massive impact on the election, but it also will mark this term as the final political chapter in a storied career. Voters have been talking about Joe Biden's age for decades, at first questioning if he was too young.
So help you God. I do. Congratulations, Senator. Thank you.
At just 30 years old, Joe Biden was sworn in as a senator from Delaware, one of the youngest in U.S. history. He did it at the hospital bedside of his two sons, who had survived the car crash that killed his wife, Nelia, and 13-month-old daughter, Amy, just weeks after the 1972 election.
I make this one promise that if in 6 months or so there's a conflict between my being a good father and being a good senator, I will contact Governor-elect Tribbett, as I had earlier, and tell him that we can always get another senator, but they can't get another father.
At times, he wanted to quit, but fellow senators urged him to stay the course.
I want to thank y'all, and really it means a lot to me. I appreciate it, and I hope that I can be a good senator for y'all.
Representing the state of Delaware for 36 years, he first set his sights on the presidency when he was in his 40s, making an unsuccessful bid for the Oval Office in 1988.
I'm angry with myself.
Followed by another attempt in 2008, before joining Senator Barack Obama's ticket and ascending to the vice presidency.
I leave here today to begin my service to our nation's first African-American president.
Tragedy rocked the Biden family again in 2015 when brain cancer took the life of the then vice president's oldest son, Beau. A year later, speculation around whether or not the then VP would enter the presidential race once again, ultimately stepping aside as Hillary Clinton became the Democratic nominee.
Historic, unprecedented moment.
In 2019, Joe Biden, fueled by then-President Trump's comments about the racist rally in Charlottesville, decided to run for president once again. During the 2020 Democratic primaries, he hinted at being a one-term president.
Look, I view myself as a bridge, not as anything else.
For Biden, the third time was the charm. At 78 years old, the man who came to Washington as one of the youngest senators became its oldest president.
At this hour, my friends, democracy has prevailed.
But his age put a magnifying glass on every stumble through the years. In April 2023, Biden announced he was running for a second term. Behind the scenes, many Democrats were concerned about his age and his poll numbers. One of them, Congressman Dean Phillips, even mounted an unsuccessful primary challenge. The American public agreed. Polls early this year found fewer and fewer Democrats confident in his mental capacity to serve as commander-in-chief. The Biden campaign, hoping to change the narrative, look to the example of Ronald Reagan, who erased concerns about his age in a 1984 debate with one iconic line.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
The Biden camp agreeing to a June debate, the earliest in modern history. But for the president, the night was a disaster, displaying a raspy voice and at times struggling to come up with coherent answers.
Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
The president's performance setting off alarms in the Democratic establishment, even his VP admitting it wasn't his best night.
There was a slow start, but a strong finish.
In the days after, Biden attempted to right the ship, hosting NATO leaders in Washington and sitting for major network interviews.
It's a bad episode. No indication of any serious condition.
Did you ever watch the debate afterwards?
I don't think I did, no.
But it wasn't enough, as dozens of House and Senate Democrats began calling for him to drop out. The growing drumbeat finally too loud to ignore.
It's up to the president to decide if he is going to run. We're all encouraging him to make that decision because time is running short.
The president's more than half a century run in Washington, D.C., now coming to a close, but not the way he wanted. To give us more context on this unprecedented moment in American politics, I want to bring in presidential historian Douglas Brinkley and NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Michael, let me begin with you. What's history tell us about this moment and where it may end up?
Tells us, Lester, that not many presidents like to give up power. George Washington established a tradition in 1795. The job wasn't term limited in those days. He could have served as president for the rest of his life and would have been elected. He was trying to establish a precedent by leaving the presidency that presidents should give up power, when it is the right time to do so. Two recent examples quickly. Truman, 1952, end of March, he said he would not run again for the presidency after losing the New Hampshire primary. 1968, Lyndon Johnson, after almost losing the New Hampshire primary, said he wouldn't seek the nomination of his party for another term. But I now know, I talked to his wife, Lady Bird, who told me what he really had in mind was that he would make peace in Vietnam and the Democratic Convention would draft him for another term, whatever he would answer, yes or no. Obviously, that never happened.
And Doug, let me turn to you. What do you think is the closest comparable moment to what we're going through now and how it may inform us of where this plays out?
Well, Michael did all the tape of Lyndon Johnson, great books. And this reminds us what everybody's saying, March of 1968, to a degree. Lyndon Johnson did a 30-minute talk and told the nation, shocked people, like some were shocked today, that I'm not running for re-election. The nomination was his for the taking. But he had other reasons. He said, I'm focusing on Vietnam. I haven't heard President Biden say I have to focus on Gaza and Israel or Ukraine. He might when he gives his speech. But alas, Lyndon Johnson looks good in history for stepping down. And he was great in the public opinion approval for a couple weeks. But then the horrible events unspooled, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy, who had challenged him. And then Chicago at the convention, things went haywire with Mayor Daley's police and yippies and Black Panthers being arrested for protesting. So everybody this year has been feeling kind of eerie about 68. And like Lyndon Johnson, Joe Biden will be remembered for his great domestic legislation, this extraordinary accomplishments done in a difficult time. He did it in a bipartisan way and was due to his great knowledge of how the Senate and Capitol Hill works that it got done. Lyndon Johnson has an extraordinary record of civil rights, voting rights, Medicaid, Medicare, on and on. So that's what's ringing my bell, LBJ.
And Michael, we know that Vice President Harris right now is getting some notable endorsements from Democrats, but this is still a fractured Democratic Party for sure. How have presidents in the past been able to unite their parties when they have been in disarray?
Well, if it was an outgoing president like Truman or Johnson, in both cases, interestingly enough, they did not make an endorsement. So the fact that Joe Biden has said, I want my successor to be Kamala Harris, not only is that something that we have not seen in those cases of history, but it also suggests that he must be pretty strong, feel pretty strongly that she would make a very good president.
And it's a complicated relationship, is it not?
It always is. And vice presidents usually wind up looking a lot different when they are candidates and presidents from the way they did as vice president. George H.W. Bush is seen as a quite commanding president, especially in foreign policy. But during his 8 years as the understudy of Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter said the problem with Bush is that he looks sort of goofy.
In moments like these, crises like this, what are the keys for leaders to cut through the noise and communicate effectively?
It is basically a matter of saying, this is the way I see this moment.
All right, Michael Beschloss and Mr. Brinkley, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, this will ultimately be in the hands of voters. Antonia Hilton has reaction from across the country tonight. Antonia, what are you hearing?
Well, voters have been shocked and emotions have been all over the place tonight, Lester, ranging from relief in some cases, gratitude to the president, and some fear of all of the uncertainty. Take a look.
Tonight, voters nationwide reacting to that historic announcement about President Biden ending his re-election bid.
Shocking, surprising, but at the same time, I think there's been a lot of talk about, worry about his age and if he's competent and able to run.
Some voters stunned, others saw it coming.
There was no way he was going to stand. After the debate against Trump, it was pretty sad.
And some say the president should have dropped out sooner.
If it was going to happen, it should have happened a lot earlier, because it'll be very hard for Democrats to win if with the current situation, because it's so close to the election.
With President Biden and a growing number of congressional Democrats now rallying behind Vice President Kamala Harris to become the new Democratic nominee, some voters happy about the change.
I do think I am more excited to vote for Kamala Harris than Joe Biden. I think she had a really great voice representing minorities.
She's been a strong advocate for women's rights, for reproductive rights and reproductive justice. I've supported her when she was named vice president for Joe Biden in 2020, and I support her now.
But some voters of color have a message to the Democratic Party. Pass over Harris at your own risk.
What do you think black voters will do if the party passes over Kamala Harris or someone else?
Is revolt a good word?
A brand new race for voters to decide, with 107 days to go until the election.
The one thing that all the Democratic voters that I've spoken to today, Lester, seem to agree on is that the party needs to unify, show some kind of camaraderie in the weeks as we head toward the DNC, Lester.
Yeah, and Antonio, is Biden dropping out and Harris stepping up changing anyone's minds?
Well, what's interesting is that surveys show that she is on par or even slightly ahead of Biden in matchups with Trump, even in those critical swing states. And I'll tell you, I spent a lot of time today with very young voters, even new voters, and some of them were skeptical of Biden, even uncertain about voting in the past. And they say they're very energized now. They appreciate a younger candidate, her energy. They say they're going to get behind her this fall if she's the nominee, Lester.
I was watching with great interest the conversations you're having with folks, and there's a kind of a narrative that in the summertime, this time of summer during an election year, people are not tuned in. They're going about their business, enjoying the summer. What I heard there is people who are tuned in, who understand the stakes and understand these candidates.
I saw the same. Chris Jansing asked me earlier, were you the person to break the news to lots of people on the street in New York about what happened with President Biden today? I did not break news to anyone. Everyone got push alerts to their phone. They were watching on Twitter. They were reacting in real time. They were tuning into our programs. And this is the youngest voters. It is the oldest voters. And everyone was bracing for this moment. I think as we've seen the news drip out these last several weeks, voters were primed for this, and their emotions were really all over the place. One of the things I really heard, especially from some of the older voters today, was a lot of gratitude for the president. In some cases, they kind of spoke directly to him through our camera, trying to say thank you for all that you've done in recent decades. This is, of course, a Democratic city, so there's a lot more of that here in New York than maybe other parts of the country. But they really were almost ready for this moment, and now that is why I think there's so much of this pressure from those Democratic voters. That signal, really, I think, to all of the members of the party right now who are watching watching and waiting to see where the chips fall. They want there to be a sort of effort to unite, clarity, and they want to see that kind of unity and support that we just saw at the RNC for Republicans at the DNC soon.
And Tony Hilton, thank you very much. We've got some developing news here. We want to go to Ali Vitali. You're watching the tally, if you will, of people who are now offering their endorsement to Vice President Harris. What have you learned?
Yeah, these endorsements do keep coming in, Lester, and there's many notable ones, including from people inside the administration, as well as other people who could have been thought of as potential challengers to the vice president, now that she is, in all effects, the person that most Democrats are looking at as the next likely nominee. Of course, we're looking at people like Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg and others on the Hill who are saying that Harris is the person that should continue carrying the mantle. Of course, all of this comes against the backdrop of, as we were just talking about, the potential for other people to try to throw their name in the ring here. I imagine, just in my conversations on Capitol Hill, that while there might be some kind of an appetite for an open convention or a more open process, there are more names now than I've ever heard in my history of covering Harris, wanting her to be the nominee, wanting her to be the standard bearer, and sort of looking at this moment where Roe versus Wade and abortion access have really come to the fore of this situation. Harris is positioned well to do that. These endorsements tell that story, Lester.
Ali Vitali, thank you. Our special coverage of President Biden's historic announcement continues, and how it's already shaking up the campaign. That's next. Hour, our NBC News special report continues. The political earthquake rocking the country. President Biden dropping out of the race for president, endorsing his Vice President Kamala Harris to replace him as the nominee. Tonight, the fallout as the country comes to grips with the late reshuffling of the race. And the questions this hour about what happens next. Vice President Harris saying she wants to earn the nomination. Many Democrats throwing their support behind her.
I think you see it coming together for a candidate who is a strong person.
Will others challenge her? Or will the party unite behind her?
She's crazy. She's nuts.
Former President Trump weighing in tonight. What he says about Kamala Harris and how voters are reacting.
I think he didn't have a chance against Trump.
As weird as that sounds, I'm excited about it.
It was a shock, but at the same time, they must feel it's best for the election.
As the race for the White House enters uncharted territory.
This is an NBC News special report. President Biden exits the 2024 race. Reporting tonight, Lester Holt.
Good evening from New York. If you are just joining us after weeks of chaos and uncertainty in the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, the 46th president of the United States, announced to the country this afternoon that he will end his campaign for re-election to a second term and immediately endorse Vice President Kamala Harris to take his place at the top of the ticket. Harris saying she is honored to have the president's endorsement, and her intention is to earn and win this nomination, her words, hinting at the process the party will have to go through to choose Mr. Biden's successor. The president's stunning announcement on a Sunday afternoon on social media followed growing calls by Democratic lawmakers for him to step aside, slipping poll numbers, loss of donor support. But also Mr. Biden's repeated statements as recently as yesterday that he intended to go on with his campaign and win. Today's decision completely upends a presidential campaign already in turmoil after Mr. Biden's debate performance less than 1 month ago. Former President Trump was quick to react to Mr. Biden's decision to end his campaign. We're covering it all on this consequential day in American history. Senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell now has late details.
A sharp turn for history. As President Biden announced at 1:46 p.m., there would be no last campaign for him. I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and to focus solely on fulfilling my duties as president for the remainder of my term. Then, in a separate statement, the president embraced his vice president. I want to offer my full support and endorsement for Kamala to be the nominee of our party this year. a move that attempts to blunt any effort to open the nomination process before the August convention. The president had praised Harris in a press conference that was intended in part to settle doubts about his candidacy.
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there.
The vice president offered thanks to the Bidens and made her intentions clear. I will do everything in my power to unite the Democratic Party and unite our nation to defeat Donald Trump. Reaction tonight from former President Barack Obama, who called Joe Biden a patriot of the highest order, describing the decision as a testament to Joe Biden's love of country. Praise from Bill and Hillary Clinton for his extraordinary career of service, while highlighting their worry about the threat posed by a second Trump term. After a half-century of public life, his political brand was forged by being underestimated.
I know, like millions of Americans know, when you get knocked down, you get back up.
The president had tried to save his shot at a second term.
And I would not be running again if I didn't believe with all my heart and soul I can do this job.
But that did not quiet the pressure after that June debate performance.
Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
An extraordinary rupture followed, a chorus of rejection that grew louder for weeks.
I think a new generation, it's time for a new generation to try to heal the party and heal the country.
The president is not capable of delivering the message in an effective way.
And when your strategy isn't working, you can't just double down on the strategy. You have to change your strategy.
And Kelly joining me now. Kelly, what an extraordinary day we have walked through. What more are we learning tonight about the president's decision?
Well, we understand that he was huddled with his closest advisors and some members of his family at his home at the beach in Delaware. And the decision evolved over this weekend, and it was what they referred to as close hold, meaning only the closest people were aware that he was about to make this decision before he alerted his campaign and a limited number of senior officials and then the public. What comes next? The president, of course, is still dealing with COVID. And so as he gets better from that and he continues to take Paxlovid, we will expect to learn more about when he will address the nation publicly. That is expected sometime this week. And we also know that he and the vice president had multiple conversations today. Lester?
Kelly, do we know if there was a tipping point that sent the president to make the final call?
A combination of things based on our reporting, where the president was basically looking at what are the chances. We know the number of voices within the Democratic Party who had come out publicly to tell him they wanted him to step aside. He had looked at his own situation of donors and changes in the support he was feeling from that group as a big part of it. As you know from your conversation with him recently, he had said 14 million Americans voted for him during the primary process, and he wanted to listen to that. He had referenced the Lord Almighty and his own well-being. Any kind of a medical issue could be things that could interfere with his quest to seek a second term. Ultimately, he found additional polling was presented to him over the weekend that looked at how Kamala Harris would do against Donald Trump, also looking at his own chances, and the weight of all those combination of factors finally got the president to a place, reluctantly and in a very human way, in a disappointed way, getting to this decision. And timing incredibly important, with the Republicans just coming off of their convention where they showed unity. Democrats had been fractured over his debate performance and his age, and now he's making a decision that can chart the course for his party. It's not set yet, as you know. There will be definitely some concerns, but he has made his choice, and we'll see more from him this week. Lester?
All right, Kelly, thank you for your continued reporting at the White House. I'm joined now by Meet the Press moderator Kristen Welker. Kristen, how confident are the sources you're talking to within the Democratic Party that Kamala Harris can clinch this nomination?
Well, Lester, they're confident and they're hopeful. And I just spoke with a top Democratic lawmaker who said there is a new energy that has been infused into this race, which has been totally upended. Donors are coming back and asking, this person said, where can they donate? How quickly can they send their money? Because it takes one big factor off the table, Lester. Remember that head-to-head polling. The fact that a majority of Americans didn't want to see this matchup, this rematch between Biden and Trump. Well, now there is no rematch between Biden and Trump. And Vice President Kamala Harris is to some extent the new face in this race. Now, yes, of course, she has served as vice president, but I've been talking to sources who say this is a chance really for her to reintroduce herself to the American people. They also, her supporters believe, as though she's found her voice on issues from reproductive rights as well as voting rights, for example. So they are feeling energized. One Democrat said they are breathing a sigh of relief. There is now someone to prosecute the case against former President Trump. I think you're going to hear that word prosecute a lot, Lester. Remember, Kamala Harris is a former prosecutor. She's hails from the great state of California, and now I think she is going to lead in part with that part of her background, that she's prosecuting the case against former President Trump. She just sent out her first fundraising email, and in it she writes, in the coming days, as I hit the campaign trail to meet with Americans and lay out the choice in front of voters in the fall, I cannot imagine two more starkly different visions for where we want our country to go. We can choose the dark path of Project 2025 with less freedom and more division, or we can choose to pull together and do the work for the people. So in order to clinch this nomination, I'm told there's going to be a virtual roll call. The goal will be for her to get the nomination there. If not, if she falls short, then you are going to see a lot of chaos. But look, some Democrats think it would be okay to have an open primary process. They say the bottom line is, Lester, there is new energy that has now been infused into this race.
It seems, though, Kristen, like this is going to be a delicate dance. I mean, she's got to start raising that money right now, as you suggested. She already has put out an appeal. But at the same time, she is probably waiting for the president to make his remarks public. We understand with his COVID diagnosis, his voice may not be up to it. But it feels like this is could be a very awkward window we're watching.
You're right about that, Lester. And think about it. This entire period has been awkward to some extent for the vice president and the president. We know, as Kelly just laid out, he was looking at polling, not just his own, but polling for the vice president as well. He wanted to see how she matches up against former President Trump. We know that she's quietly been looking at some of the potential people that she might want to pick as a running mate. Of course, looking at a lot of those governors who hail from battleground states all across the country. Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania, Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, and of course another name that gets a lot of buzz, Governor Gavin Newsom from California. Tough to see two people running from California, but look, just to give you a sense, there are a lot of names right now and a lot of different moving parts that need to fall into place in order for Democrats to head into Chicago unified behind a nominee and a running mate. So, Lester, that's the goal, I am told. Will they be able to accomplish that? That remains to be seen. But again, you and I were in Milwaukee together, Lester, and we continued night after night to talk about the unity that we witnessed within the Republican Party, how stark that unity was, for example, as compared to 2016, the unity behind former President Trump. I think that added urgency to Democrats to make this decision in short order, because they know, look, they're about 4 months out from Election Day, and they've got to get going if they want to take on Trump.
All right, Kristen Walker, thank you. For Vice President Kamala Harris, today's endorsement by President Biden and now her potential path to the presidency represent the latest chapter in a political journey that began years ago in California, as we noted. Hallie Jackson has more.
The spotlight tonight turning to Vice President Kamala Harris, one of President Biden's most vocal backers since that debate widely panned as disastrous.
It was a slow start. There's no question about that. But I thought it was a strong finish. We are looking at a president in Joe Biden who has done historic work.
Now, the president's endorsement of Harris puts her in the pole position to take the top of the ticket. Harris, in a statement today, saying in part, "I am honored to have the president's endorsement, and my intention is to earn and win this nomination." Adding, "We have 107 days until Election Day. Together we will fight, and together we will win." In recent days, some of the president's key allies have signaled if he were to step aside, it is Harris who should get Democrats' support.
This party should not in any way do anything to work around Ms. Harris.
Congressman Jim Clyburn today publicly backing Harris, with other Democrats following suit. The exception, the party's top leaders in the House and Senate, stopping short of an endorsement but praising the president for his service. Whether it's Harris at the top of the ticket or not, other Democrats have been speculated to be in the mix, perhaps as a running mate, including California Governor Gavin Newsom.
President Biden doesn't run. Why shouldn't we consider you a likely candidate?
Well, I think the vice president is naturally the one lined up.
Pennsylvania's Josh Shapiro, Michigan's Gretchen Whitmer, Kentucky's Andy Beshear, and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Harris, a former prosecutor who rose to become California's Attorney General, was elected to the Senate in 2016 and ran for the White House 3 years later.
I love my country, and I feel a sense of responsibility to stand up and fight for the best of who we are.
After being selected as President Biden's running mate, she was tapped by the White House to lead the administration's response on critical issues like the root causes of the immigration crisis, coming under fire from Republicans for the White House's handling of the border, and pressed by Lester on the topic in 2021.
We've been to the border. We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe. And I mean, I don't understand the point that you're making. I'm not discounting the importance of the border.
Harris has taken on a vocal role advocating for abortion access, slamming the GOP for its position on reproductive rights.
How dare they tell a woman what she can do and cannot do with her own body? How dare they?
Now a pivotal political moment for Harris and the nation.
First to say, when you get knocked down, you get back.
And Hallie Jackson joins me now, as well as Chuck Todd, NBC News chief political analyst. Good to have you both here. Hallie, let me start with you. How critical for the Democrats are these next 24 to 36 hours?
Pretty critical, I think it's fair to say, Lester, especially with what you've seen even over the course of the last 6 to 8 hours here since this announcement came out. It has been somewhat remarkable, the speed by which some of those names we mentioned in that piece you just watched, those names of people who could potentially challenge Kamala Harris for the top of the ticket or become her running mate have come out and endorsed her. We're talking about, for example, Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro, Roy Cooper, the governor of North Carolina, has come out now and done the same. An indication here that the Democratic Party is moving quickly to try to solidify behind Kamala Harris to a degree to show that level of unity that you and that Kristen were talking about earlier as you're looking now at some of those notable endorsements for Kamala Harris, including, of course, from such big names in the party as the Clintons, as Congressman Clyburn, who was critical, remember, in getting President Biden's campaign back in 2020 up and running and helping him win the nomination back then. So for Democrats, there is, I think, a real question of how do they get unity quickly. I will also tell you, though, Lester, that is somewhat tempered, and I just had a conversation with a Democratic member of Congress about this, by the idea that they don't want this to look as though the process is moving so quickly that it's leaving voters out. I think there is a sense that they do want to make sure that there is a process that includes the will of the voters, that this does not appear that it's simply levers being pulled by top officials in the party here. There is a significant, I think, nod to that as well. I think the question is going to be, what does the roll call look like? And I know Chuck will get into the weeds with you on the delegate selection and how this would work at a convention, but what does that next 4 weeks 4 weeks tomorrow is the start of the Democratic convention. What does Chicago look like, Lester?
And Chuck, I was speaking to Jason Miller of the Trump campaign a few minutes ago. It's clear they're going to go after the areas in which Kamala Harris was leading the administration's efforts, including the border. Are they looking at a one-size-fits-all attack plan, or will they be a little bit off their game?
Well, I think they're going to be a little thrown off because I think abortion, you now have a nominee of the Democratic Party that isn't going to be afraid to say the word. It was one of those, there were a lot of Democrats quietly grumbling about President Biden sometimes on this issue. He sort of, the language has changed on him from when, from a majority of the time he was in office. But I really think they're going to go hard at border and trying to define her as she was the person that pulled Joe Biden to the left, right? They'll actually try to start praising Biden some by saying, and Harris was one pulling him to the left. It's why the combination of that and the border issue, I think Mark Kelly, and I'm hearing from more people close to her, that Mark Kelly, look, she's got to, and I think she ought to use this process to interview a wide range of people for the running mate position. I've heard Mark Milley's name tossed about, as well as Admiral McRaven, a couple of retired members of the military. She ought to draw it out. It's a way for the country to get to know her. It sucks up a little bit more oxygen. But Mark Kelly would probably be the running mate that the Trump campaign would fear the most, because he would be there to neutralize on the border. He was very critical constantly of both President Biden and Vice President Harris on the border. He had to, coming from the state he comes from. And then you have the intangible factors. This is a family touched by political violence. It's one of those, it's sort of it reminds people that this is a bipartisan issue we're trying to deal with.
Is this an animating moment, though, when you step back, an animating moment for a party that just spent the last several days watching Republicans in what at times felt like a love fest, frankly?
Well, I think it's what increased the pressure on President Biden to do what he did. I think when you saw this is a very unified Republican Party, the most unified arguably since George W. Bush in 2004. And you know, there was a lack of energy, there was a lack of enthusiasm. We've been seeing it all year. You know, I think one of the unintended consequences of all this is we had been heading to a very low turnout election. The country had told us they didn't really want to see it. The presidential debate, which of course sparked all of this, Lester, the lowest rated first presidential general election debate we ever had. Fewer people tuned into it. People thought they already knew these guys. All of a sudden now there's a massive plot twist. And I think you're going to see more people engaged. And it's an opportunity for both former President Trump and Vice President Harris, because I think there's an extra group of voters who had sort of given up on the system that they were giving them two unpopular candidates, and they might take a listen.
And Hallie, we have, of course, not seen the president come out. He is still apparently suffering the effects of COVID. But how important is that moment where we actually see him presumably with Vice President Harris in the Rose Garden or some other location?
Yeah, wherever it may be, and of course, presuming that he is, in fact, appearing with the vice president. It's an important moment for the country, Lester. It's an important moment for Democrats, but it's also an important moment for history. Remember how extraordinary this is here. This is a generational thing. We haven't seen this in decades, something like this, and that's to say that there even is anything like this here. So when President Biden addresses the nation, whenever that may be at some point this week, he will be essentially laying that down for the history books. And you're already hearing praise from Democrats who are touting President Biden and what he's doing is the ultimate act of selflessness. You're hearing that from members of his family. You're hearing that from key allies. I expect the president may end up striking that tone to a degree. And then, of course, what does he do to essentially pass the ball or pass the baton to his vice president, to Kamala Harris? Does she appear alongside him? Does he give her that full-throated endorsement with the backdrop, of course, the important backdrop of the White House, of the, Oval Office or Rose Garden or East Room or wherever this may end up happening. So I think there's going to be so many people watching that, watching to see his tone, his demeanor. Because remember, Lester, while he is withdrawing from the ticket, he is not leaving the White House. He will continue, of course, to stay in that position of the presidency until the end of his term. So there is still, for lack of a better phrase here, Lester, there's still business to be done. There's still work to be done over the course of the next several months, aside from the political campaign, Lester.
All right, Hallie, thank you very much. I'm joined now by presidential historian John Meacham, who has helped write key speeches for President Biden. John, have you spoken to the president today or at any point leading up to his decision?
I spoke to him today after the decision. I learned about it with the rest of the world. And I think what we should do, as you have been doing, is realize, as Hallie was just saying, the magnitude of this. Yes, there are the politics, and yes, we're naturally going to be looking at what happens the day after and the day after tomorrow. But what President Biden did was a remarkable act of both patriotism and personal courage. It's very, very rare for anyone in any sphere of life to sacrifice something under whatever circumstances, much less at the highest levels. The pinnacle of temporal power, arguably in the world, is the White House. And he respected reality. He respected fate, as he likes to say. He's a great respecter of fate. And I think understood, like Lincoln, that public sentiment is everything. With it, you can do anything. Without it, you can't do anything. And so this was a recognition of his duty, I think, to the country.
You said you spoke to him today. I don't expect you to give the full details of a private conversation, but can you give us a sense of what his headspace was like? Was he as combative and defiant as he'd been in the days leading up to this?
You're right. I don't want to discuss a conversation. I think the letter captures where he is. Remember, President Biden I think I've always thought this, is rather like an upside-down iceberg. You see most of it, and sometimes it's perhaps, there's always, for all of us, there's some part we don't see. But he has been doing this a very long time, and he looked at reality, he made his decision, and I think it's an example for all of us, really. I don't mean to be sentimental. I don't mean to be mindlessly congratulatory about it. But as a historical matter, very, very few people do this. And in an era where so many of us privilege power over principle, where a lot of us would rather take than give, I think it's a moment for the country to consider that the president has given us a lesson that our own wishes, our own immediate desires, should not always be controlling.
He had apparently indicated to others that he didn't think that him coming off the ticket would be the magic bullet that many thought. He really thought he could win. Do you suspect there's a part of him that still thinks he could win?
I don't know. I will say that as my friends in Tennessee, I think it was Estes Kefauver, once said, the only cure for politics is embalming fluid. And so I can't really imagine that there's not something, let's just be honest, in his psychology. Of course, he's been doing this for 50 years, more. And so political creatures are political creatures. That's what's so amazing about the decision he made, is he's a politician who made a principled decision. And I'd love to say that politicians always do that, but as it's been said of John F. Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, that there's a reason it's short and one volume. You know, it's not a ton of examples out there. This is one.
You may have heard last Monday, I guess it was, that I sat down with the president for an interview, and one of the questions I asked him, who does he rely on, for, counsel during crises like this, and he says he relies on himself. Did that surprise you at all? You know him, obviously, in a way that I don't.
Yeah, that was a really interesting moment in your interview. Not really, in terms of surprise. If you think about it, he's doing this a long time. Counted out again and again and again. Remember, Joe Biden's life is one of remarkable victory. 29 years old, youngest senator, he has to wait for his birthday to get sworn in, all of that. And then tragedy strikes. His life unfolds with the expectation that he'll be a very young president. And the 1988 campaign implodes. He goes back to the Senate. He barrels down. He almost resigned, by the way, the Senate before he took the job. He was going to go back to Wilmington, raise Hunter and Beau after the death of his wife and daughter. His sister Valerie was very much involved, and that was going to be the story. He wasn't going to go, and was encouraged to do so, not least by the incumbent senators at the time. And he likes to say it probably saved his life. And then he's sort of counted out. He has health issues in that era, and loses in 2008, becomes vice president, no expectation of that. And in 2016, we thought the story was over, right? His son Beau has died. He has decided not to run for president in 2016, and that seemed to be the end of the story. And then Charlottesville happened. And the unfolding, still relevant threat was a compelling reason for him to step into the breach. And that's what he did for American democracy and for his vision of what the country should be. Remarkably successful legislative president. I think I'm a biographer of George Herbert Walker Bush. I think President Biden's handling of Ukraine and NATO in particular ranks with some of our finest foreign policy moments ever. Remember how you don't get much credit politically. This is what people like me do. You don't get much credit for keeping bad things from happening. That politics doesn't reward that. History has to reward that. And so it's a difficult thing sometimes to translate that kind of success into immediate political benefit.
And John,
and that's just a perennial problem.
Before I let you go, as we noted, you have written, key parts of speeches for the president before. Will the speech that he will ultimately give when he's healthy enough to go before the cameras, will that be his toughest?
I can't see how it wouldn't be. I will say this, though, and I think this might be important for all of us to bear in mind. This is not the worst day of Joe Biden's life, by a long, long shot. He has experienced more tragedy, he has prevailed, he has endured, and he has served. And I think the country should take a moment and reflect on that.
All right, John Meacham, thank you so much for coming on with us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Let's bring in NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles. Ryan, if you can bring us up to speed on the latest endorsements that have come in for Vice President Harris.
We just got a significant one in the last few minutes, Lester Holt, and that is Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York. She, of course, a leading progressive figure, someone who was among the group of congressional Democrats that was insistent that Joe Biden stay in the race. And one of the things that we've been closely tracking is whether or not progressive Democrats would get behind Kamala Harris's campaign. And she has now given Kamala Harris her full-throated endorsement, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And she joins a growing list of Democrats that are rallying around Kamala Harris as the nominee of the Democratic Party. They include Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, someone who might be considered as a candidate himself. And Gavin Newsom may also be considered as Kamala Harris's running mate if it gets to that point. We also saw endorsements from Bill and Hillary Clinton, Congressman James Clyburn of South Carolina, who's a powerful member of the Congressional Black Caucus. Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, has also endorsed Josh Shapiro, who is the governor of Pennsylvania, considered a rising star in the Democratic Party, also someone that we should watch as a potential running mate for Kamala Harris if she's able to win the nomination. You also saw Congressman Adam Schiff of California, who's likely to become the next senator from California and is also closely aligned with Nancy Pelosi as well. So, Lester, while we've seen a lot of Democrats come forward and express support for Kamala Harris, say that she should be the nominee, there are still many that believe that this should be an open contest, that there should be the opportunity for other Democrats to throw their hat in the ring as well, some describing it as it not wanting to be a coronation. So we're going to continue to have to watch this process play itself out as we head into the convention coming up next month. Lester.
Okay, Ryan, thank you. I'm joined by Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts. He was one of the first Democrats to call on Mr. Biden to end his campaign for re-election. Congressman, thank you for being with us.
Good to see you,
tell me where you are right now. You were among, again, the first to make this call. You have endorsed Vice President Harris. Are you feeling better about the future of your party right now?
Oh, absolutely. This is a great day. It's a great day for our country. It's a great day for our party. And it's a great day for President Biden. I think this will burnish his legacy. He will go down in history as someone who not only wielded great power, but had the courage to give it up, to pass on the torch to the next generation. And he'll be remembered fondly for this moment, in addition to his decades of legislative accomplishments, both in the White House and in the Senate.
But do you miss an opportunity if the party does not embrace the idea of an open vote, to let others throw their hat in the ring if they wish?
Well, I'm not opposed to an open vote at all. I've proudly endorsed Vice President Harris. I think she's ready to go. She's been training, being in the White House for 4 years. She can tap right into all the Biden campaign resources that he's accumulated, this amazing infrastructure across the country. And of course, there's not that much time. She's going to show Americans that she has an incredible vision for the future of our country, in contrast to Donald Trump's dark vision of taking us backwards. But having said that, my endorsement for her doesn't mean that there shouldn't be an open process. I think that the Democratic Party has shown here that, unlike the Republican Party, we are willing to respond to Americans' concerns. Remember, 3 out of 5 Americans said they didn't want Trump or Biden to be the nominees. One party has said, hey, we hear you, America. We're making a change.
Can you do a campaign can a campaign be done that quickly, though, given you're right, there's a lot of cash that's potentially available, but in terms of just covering the territory, finding a running mate, what does that look like?
Well, in many ways, that's why the vice president is so well positioned to take the reins here and run with them. And she has a lot of that infrastructure. She has that experience of being in the White House. But yes, there is time, Lester, because the contrast is so great. You know, this is not running against someone like Mitt Romney. This is running against Donald Trump. His very dark vision for the country, the Project 2025 things, taking rights away from women, bringing us back to the 1950s. I mean, this is not a vision that most Americans want to embrace. So I think there's plenty of time for the vice president or whoever the nominee is to show that massive contrast with Trump and ultimately win the election.
All right, Congressman, thank you for taking time to be with us. It's good to talk to you.
Good to see you, Lester.
Still ahead, we'll talk to Congressman James Clyburn, who played a big part in getting President Biden elected, about what's next for the future of the Democratic Party. That's after this. Welcome back to our coverage. President Biden's win in the 2020 Democratic primary hinged largely on the support of one man, South Carolina Congressman Jim Clyburn. He helped secure the nomination for President Biden when he ran 4 years ago. And the congressman is good enough to join us this evening. Thank you for being with us tonight, sir.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Have you spoken to the president today?
Yes, I have.
And can you give me a sense of your conversation and where his headspace is tonight?
Well, I think it's in his letter. The president called me earlier today before he went public with the announcement. And when I asked him a few questions, he read to me from the letter and informed me at that time that he would be sending a second statement expressing his endorsement for Kamala Harris. Of course, he knew for a long time where I stood with this. I always told him that he had my full support, and I was not going to change my mind unless he changed his. And so he called me this earlier today, told me that he had changed his mind and was not going to run.
Congressman, are you disappointed, and I don't mean disappointed necessarily in Vice President Harris, but are you disappointed that it has come to this?
Well, you know, Joe Biden is a longtime friend of mine. We developed this friendship over a period of time. He, being from Delaware, we had similar backgrounds growing up, and we often talked about that. In Brown v. Board of Education, the court decision that changed the direction of this country, 1954, the Brown was 5 cases from 4 states in the District of Columbia. One of those states, of course, it started in South Carolina, but one of the states was Delaware. And that's how we met, discussing Brown and what led to Brown and the similarities between the states of Delaware and South Carolina. And he used to spend most of his vacation time here in South Carolina. And so I got to know him real well. And I think he's one of the best public servants we ever produced in this country. And so, yes, I'm disappointed that his career would come to this kind of an end. But I just think it's coming a little soon. But it's the kind of career that anybody would be proud to have.
Do you think
54 years?
Do you think the party is staged to in a position to win now based on what has occurred?
Oh, I think so. Yes. Campaigns are all about the future. And when we get beyond Labor Day, we're going to go through this process. We don't go into convention until the 19th of August. We'll come out of there 4 or 5 days later, and then everybody will take their breaks for the holidays. And after Labor Day, we are going to take this campaign to the American people, drawing a contrast between the vision that the Democrats have for the future of this great country and that which they see on the other side of the aisle. Project 2025 is a document that is a blueprint for what the Republican Party would like to see the future of this country be. and that is a future without the safety nets that's made this country as great as it is. But for Social Security coming out of the Great Depression back in the 1930s, where would this country be? When we have people committing their total lives to making this a great country, then they find themselves in their golden years not able to fend for themselves. They want to get rid of Social Security. At least this document says raise retirement age from 67 to 70. Who retires earlier? Working men and women, when it comes to lifespan, is a little bit different than if you're working all your life in an air-conditioned office.
And Congressman, let me ask you.
These guys on the other side's got no sensitivity for the working men and women, and we're going to be able to draw that contrast in this campaign, and we're going to win this election.
As we noted, you've endorsed Kamala Harris, the vice president, to get the nomination. Is she being served well, or is the Democratic Party being served well if there is not an open process, if there is the hint or the suggestion that this is more of a coronation?
Come on, the process is open. It's been open ever since the spring of the year. We put in place a process by which anybody who wants to can get into this race, and it's open. You get 300 signatures right now. Get 300 signatures, no more than 50 from any one state, and you can have your name placed into nomination. And then you politic among the delegates like everybody else will. There's nothing closed about this process. And I said that from the very beginning when I was first talking about, should we have a minute primary? I says, you don't need a minute primary. Our Rules Committee put in place a process which is akin to having a minute primary. What difference would you have if you got to run outside of this process? We have the rules, and when you start changing the rules, that's when you get in trouble with people. The rules are there. They're open. They're transparent. And you can see them and you can play within them. That's what we all do. Follow the rule.
And then finally, can you talk to me, reflect, if you will, on the potential history that could be made here, a woman of color ascending to the presidency?
Well, this country has always been about seeking perfection in order to have a more perfect union. And admission from the very beginning that we are not a perfect nation, but we're always in pursuit of perfection. And this is just another step in that direction. This country has been around for a pretty long time compared to a lot of European countries. Not a long time, but a pretty long time. We have been in existence since 1776, and we've never had a woman to hold this office. That is unlike the European countries where we grew out of. And so we will be making history if we were to be successful with this candidacy. And what's wrong with that? That is what this country is all about, pursuing perfection, and this will be another step in that direction. And I do believe we are going to do that come November.
Congressman Clyburn, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
With President Biden out of the 2024 race now, we're taking a look at what the polls show in a head-to-head matchup between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Trump. NBC News national political correspondent Steve Kornacki joins me now to kind of walk us through it all. Steve?
Yeah, Lester, I mean, that is the strategic question for Democrats. They were concerned about Joe Biden's ultimate ability to win this election. If they do end up with Kamala Harris as their presidential candidate now, does it change the basic political realities they were worried about? So look at it this way. This is the average of all of the national polls conducted since that debate at the end of June that started all of this. And you see the average, Biden trailing Trump by 2 points nationally. Of course, very significant, not just that Biden was behind, but if you went back 4 years to 2020, there really was no point in the entire campaign when Biden trailed Trump in the national average. So that made that even more significant. But okay, since that debate, these polls have also started to ask, well, what about Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee, offering respondents that choice as well. And the polls that have tested both of them, here's the average for Harris versus Trump. Not much different. Harris does do a point better than Biden. 45 goes to 46. In the average, Trump stays at 47. So at least at the beginning, if Democrats do go with Harris, they'd be taking a candidate trailing by 2 on average, replacing with a candidate who trails by 1 on average. Of course, the question is the introduction of Kamala Harris as a presidential candidate, the Democratic convention, the new attention on her. Would that help those numbers? Would that improve them? Conversely, would that hurt those numbers potentially if the rollout doesn't go that well? Those are some of the variables, though. But that's the starting point on head-to-head. And we also look at the basic image of each candidate. When we ask the question, favorable or unfavorable view do you have? Again, the average for Joe Biden has been very bad. 36% favorable, 57% unfavorable. Now, Kamala Harris, where does she clock in here? Little bit better, but not much. 36 to 38 on the favorable side, and the unfavorable comes down 57 to 52. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, who she'd like to run against now, you see where he stands. These numbers are a bit better for him than they've been in the past. 41% favorable, 55 unfavorable. And again, whether it's Kamala Harris or if it happens to be anybody else, whoever emerges as the Democratic candidate, just the basic challenge they're facing is this. Here is the road to 270 electoral votes, and you see the 6 core swing states right here that are expected to decide the presidency. You see Harris would have to win a number of those states here, but the other challenge for her, and something that drove Biden from this race, is that Democrats were starting to get indications outside of these battleground states of unexpected trouble in places like Virginia, New Hampshire, Maine. In the popular vote in Maine, they give out electoral votes by congressional district there, even potentially in a state like Minnesota. So for Harris or whoever the Democratic nominee becomes, the two challenges are, first of all, shore up states like that Democrats weren't expecting to have to sweat over, and then get to work in those battleground states. Again, all those battleground states in 2020 were Joe Biden states, Lester.
All right, Steve Kornacki, thank you. Our special coverage, our look at President Biden's more than half a century in public service and what his decision means for the next chapter of American history. We'll be back. We are back with our special coverage of President Biden ending his campaign for re-election. Let's bring in senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett. Laura, what happens to Biden's campaign war chest? A lot of money there.
Yeah, and I think there's been sort of a working assumption that it automatically goes to Harris, but it's not actually that simple since they're not actually the official nominee. Now, because donors made contributions to them sort of as partners, there could be an argument, I think, by her that was their intent. But we've already seen Republicans coming out tonight saying they might want to challenge this, saying she's not necessarily guaranteed to the money since she wasn't at the top of the ticket. And so I think you should watch for lawsuits potentially on this front.
Could those lawsuits be trying to force them to return the money?
Yes, and there could be a situation in which they give the money back to the DNC, or they could give the money back to the donors, and then the donors could actually redonate to Harris. She's already filed the necessary paperwork with the FCC tonight. And also, we should mention, a progressive donation platform, Act Blue, said it raised $27.5 million already within the first 5 hours of her being announced, Lester. So Democrats already mobilizing around her.
All right, Laura, thank you. Let's bring in former U.S. Senator and NBC News political analyst Claire McCaskill. Mark Lauder, Director of Strategic Communications for Donald Trump's 2020 re-election campaign, joins us as well. Claire, former Senator Kamala Harris, officially, of course, running for president. Could we see any Democrats challenge her?
Well, as Jim Clyburn said, they're welcome to. Kamala Harris was chosen by Joe Biden to be there in case he ever needed to step aside as president. And she was on the ballot and gained the votes of 14 million Democrats in the primary process. So you're seeing today, I think, Lester, in some ways, almost a surprising coalescence to people who aren't watching this carefully by the Democratic Party around Kamala Harris. The leaders have held off, wanting to make sure that nobody thought this was being forced down anyone's throats. But anybody can step up and try to challenge at the convention. The delegates have been released. But I have a feeling that our convention, the Democratic Party's convention, is going to be very united behind Kamala Harris.
And Mark, how does this historic shakeup change Donald Trump's campaign calculations, do you think?
I really don't think it changes it that much, Lester.
Kamala Harris owns the same horrible policies that made Joe Biden the most unpopular president in 70 years, whether it's on energy, inflation, the southern border, even foreign relations. I don't see a policy change. I don't see Kamala Harris suddenly coming out and saying drill, baby, drill, or let's do something about the border. And those are big issues on the minds of the American people. So I think the campaign will stay the same, and the name on the bumper sticker we're running against is the only thing that changes.
I was at the Republican convention last week covering the activities there, and watching the unity there, I was thinking, what happens if Democrats, are able to get to the place they can have some unity and excitement? They seem to be, from what we're seeing here tonight, beginning to have that. Should that be a worry for the Republican Party?
Well, usually both parties come out of their conventions fairly unified. There might be some grousing here and there. So I fully expect that after their convention, they will be behind whomever their nominee is. And then it's a race to the finish line. But I think when you look at the Electoral College map, when you look at the polling right now, it's all in favor of Donald Trump. And I don't think just changing out to Kamala Harris or anyone else is going to provide that big of a bump. Because remember, the final margin in 2020 was 4.5% in the national vote. It was only 43,000 votes in 3 states in the Electoral College, so they're way behind where they need to be right now.
And Claire, the vice president, is now, I guess, officially a candidate for the presidency. Her actions and movements in this next couple of days, how critical are they? Are there some traps along the way she should be aware of?
Listen, this is going to be a difficult process. It's a sprint rather than a marathon. But I think the American people really don't love long campaigns anyway. And I'm going to tell you on policies, Lester, remember, all the Democratic senators in the battleground states are winning in the polls. So the policies are not the problem. And I think with this now, a youthful candidate compared to a very old candidate, a prosecutor versus someone who has been prosecuted, I like the contrast.
The fact that she has so quickly emerged, though, and received all these endorsements, is there going to be a window here? In other words, are folks going to have to declare very, very quickly where they are on this?
Well, if there's going to be a credible challenge to her, I think it would have to emerge in the next 24 hours, because obviously if somebody was really going to challenge her at the convention, they've got a lot of work to do. So the fact that you're seeing all the candidates who've been talked about as potential presidential candidates, almost all of them have already endorsed her. So I really don't think there is going to be anyone credible that's going to emerge. And now it's a matter of her getting organized, her getting her team together, and her making sure that she stays focused on what I know she's focused on, and that is the American people and what they want for the future, as opposed to retribution, grievance, and revenge.
Yeah, and Mark, very quickly, at the end of the day, is this going to change the dynamics in a big way in your view?
No, I think it'll give a new shot of energy to the Democrats temporarily, but I do think it's going to come down to the policies in the end, and I think that's where the trouble lies for Kamala Harris or whomever takes the nomination.
All right, Claire McCaskill, Mark Lauder, thank you both for being with us. Finally, he has been a fixture in American politics for more than half a century. President Biden's historic decision to end his campaign for re-election is what may be the final chapter in the story of a political giant. Tonight, President Biden's decision to drop his bid for re-election, a stunning and abrupt end to a 5-decade-long political career. The president stepping aside under immense pressure from fellow Democrats who feared he could not repeat his performance of 4 years ago when he narrowly defeated former President Trump.
So help me God.
He had waited longer than any other commander-in-chief to achieve his lifelong ambition, elected to the Senate at age 29 in 1973. Weeks later, a tragic car accident.
My wife and 3 children were Christmas shopping. Tractor trailer broadsided it and killed my wife and killed my daughter.
He led the controversial confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas, featuring sexual harassment allegations from Anita Hill.
Is this what you anticipated?
This? No, not at all.
And as senator, he helped pass the landmark Violence Against Women Act. In 2008, then candidate Barack Obama tapped him to be his running mate. Later, Vice President Biden famously caught on a hot mic celebrating the passage of the Affordable Care Act. He also pushed President Obama to support same-sex marriage by publicly declaring his support for it first.
I am absolutely comfortable with the fact that men marrying men, women marrying women, and heterosexual men and women marrying women all are entitled to the same exact rights.
After his son Beau died of brain cancer, Joe Biden said he didn't think about running for president again in 2020 until he saw Donald Trump enter the race.
We're in a battle for the soul of this nation.
That January, he told me he had the experience to unite the country.
The next president of the United States is going to inherit a divided country and a world in disarray. And the question is, who is best prepared at this moment to be able to deal with both of those crises?
That seems like a bold statement from any politician in this environment right now to suggest that you might be able to heal the depth of divisions in this country.
We have to. Lester, if we don't, we are in deep trouble.
Later that year, we spoke at a town hall after his first debate with then-President Trump.
I'm used to bullies. I used to stutter when I was a kid. I learned how to fight.
Democrats celebrated his win over Mr. Trump. And as president, he had success overseeing the end of the pandemic and passing a historic bipartisan infrastructure law.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
But he also struggled with low approval ratings, a record number of migrants crossing the border, and soaring inflation, something I pressed him about.
You said inflation was going to be temporary. I think a lot of Americans are wondering what your definition of temporary is.
Well, you're being a wise guy with me a little bit, and I understand.
And there'll be much more conversation, of course, on all this. For now, that concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have continuing coverage throughout the night on our streaming service, NBC News Now. Also tomorrow on Today. Thank you for joining me, everyone. I'm Lester Holt in New York. Good day.